Yes. So, hey everyone, welcome to our town hall. We're here with the MODA office from New York City, from the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics. And we are joined by two members of the team. And we'll do some quick introductions. First, I'm Molly Dillon. I'm going to moderate our town hall. I'm a former government worker, both at the federal level. I used to serve in President Obama's White House for a few years, and then in the state in the executive chamber, and now I'm in the philanthropic world. But I'm also here in my capacity as a co-author that I was told to hold up this book. It's coming out on Tuesday. If you want to talk about it afterwards with me, be happy to. It's called Yes, She Can, and it's about young women working in the Obama White House, and we're trying to get more young women to want to go into government, and young women, people of color, people with disabilities, like we want more diversity in all levels of service, especially at the staff level. So that's our mission, and that's kind of what we wrote about. And that's me, and I'm going to kick it over to my awesome town hall joiners, leaders. Kelly, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so super excited you all are here. We're going to get some folks to clear away stuff in the back, so hopefully you guys can, in the back, can sit down. Again, my name is Kelly Jin, Chief Analytics Officer and Director of the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics here in New York City. For those of you who were just at the opening plenary session, gave a few top-level remarks, but really wanted to spend more time during this town hall explaining a little bit more about the team, the work, what we've learned to date, as well as the vision moving forward, and of course taking plenty of questions from you all here in the room. A quick overview of what the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics does, and Adrian, please definitely fill in the pieces here as well. So we are actually a pretty small but nimble team. There are 8 of us to date, including myself, and we are really focused on how can the city both internally across the 80+ agencies that you all heard Gale mention, as well as engaging with external stakeholders, use data and analytics to make better decisions. And so today we're really going to focus in on what does that mean, some examples. We're going to talk about our own experiences as well, which will be really, really fun. And we may have time just to dive more into the specifics around the programs. I think the interesting thing to note, if you didn't get it from the morning sessions, is that the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, also known as MODA, we work with Do It, which is the city's IT agency, to effectively run the open data program and the portal. And that's a lot of work. And that is a big portion of the work that we do. So that's me at a top line. I'll turn it over to Adrian for intro.
Sure. Hi, everybody. My name is Adrian Schmucker. I'm the Deputy Chief Analytics Officer at MODA, also the Director of Civic Engagement and Strategy. I've been at MODA for almost 2 years. I've been with the City of New York for almost 4. I was in the CTO's office before coming over to MODA. It used to be called the Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation. So that's my kind of public sector background, and I think we might talk a little bit more about the time we spent before city government a little bit later. But actually, before we dive in, I have just a quick question. Can you raise your hand if you've used NYC Open Data? Amazing, okay. For people who didn't raise their hand, and in case you haven't used it, it's a term that's been mentioned a lot in the last hour and a half, and in case you were interested in coming to School of Data to learn what that is, it's data that's published by city agencies on nyc.gov/opendata. So I know that people come to these events also because they're like data curious and hoping to learn about something. So in case that helps demystify a little bit of what we're going to be talking about over the course of the day, I wanted to put that out there.
Cool. So my first question for you guys, and you kind of started to get into it already, Kelly, is for those of us maybe less familiar, what is MODA, and like what are you guys up to these days?
What is MODA? So I think I'll give a few thoughts here. I mentioned I started 4.5 months ago. It is during that time, I think what's been really, really interesting to me is that when you use the term data or you use the term analytics, it encompasses, or it feels like it encompasses, many different conversations. And so from my perspective, the work that we've done to date has really been focused on what are the needs out there across the city, both, again, internally and externally, and then backing into the data and analytics conversation. And so for folks in this room who understand or have a business background or a policy background, it means that when we move, we don't move data first, right? We actually sit down with folks and say, what are the higher level challenges and problems that you are working through today? And then bring in this question of data and systems and analytics a little bit later on. I think the pieces to note for you all, just to get more concrete, we already talked about the open data program and portal that we run. A lot of our other work is focused on specific analytics projects in partnership with city agencies. So if you go online and you look at the analytics team website, the actual work that we've done, whether that is rolling out pre-K for all, or that is around in 2015 when there was a Legionnaires' outbreak in the Bronx that was working on integrating data across different city agencies. Our work has always taken a different flavor, just depending on what the needs are at any given moment in time. I'll say the second piece that I wanted to say here was that that means with a team of 8 that when I walked in the door, we've been working on many, many different things and supporting many different stakeholders and having many, many different conversations. I think for those of you who work in organizations or lead organizations here in the room, you know it's really, really hard to do many different things all really well. And I think that there is this moment in time, and Adrian and I have talked a lot about this, of what are the top priorities that we need to work on across the city. And I think for me, it's increasingly taking this citywide perspective. So I know that there are a ton of analytics teams throughout all of the city agencies. They've done this. Some of them are modeled after the MODA model. Some of them have an entirely different flavor. And so increasingly, my perspective around the team is how do we lift the floor? As we frequently would talk about at the White House, how do we lift the data literacy and analytics floor across the city, both internally and externally, and use MODA and the platform to work on best practices, right? Because we are getting a lot of that incoming. I'll toss it over to Adrian for additional thoughts.
Yeah, sure. I think to build off of what Kelly just said, I think something that's important to keep in mind, Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer, as she was speaking, I think was helping give a little bit of context and a nice reminder about New York City as a place and how big we are and how much we have to keep that in mind. The same thing goes for New York City as like a government organization, right? Like there are more than 300,000 people who work for the city of New York, serving 8.6 million constituents. That is big. We are an enterprise level organization that is hundreds of years old. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. And one thing that I like to say when I'm giving an overview of MODA, and as I mentioned, builds off of what Kelly just said, is that we're a team of 8 people. Like we're not going to be doing all of the analytics work for the city of New York.
It's like 1 for every 1 million people.
Yes, exactly.
Okay. Cool.
And that's what we do every day. So here's my million, here's your million. No, so I think that raising the floor is how we're going to make change, right? And so we've piloted a few things over the course of the last year. A colleague on the team, Mitsue Iwata, has done a lot of great work just kind of building a grassroots network of analysts within the city. We've piloted this group, this community of practice that we're calling the Analytics Exchange. It's really an internal network so that an analyst at the Department of Transportation can speak to an analyst over at the Department of Housing Preservation and Development and say, we're trying to solve very different problems, but we both have firewall issues. Like, what exactly are you doing to help problem solve around this? And so it's facilitating those types of conversations and thinking about the fact that our office is positioned in the executive office as a mayor's office. Like, how can we act as a representative to these communities across the city of analytics teams, of people who want to learn more about city data, to do more data-driven decision-making in their work? And how can we essentially act as advocates for those communities and help make the city of New York more data-driven as a government operation to better serve New Yorkers?
Awesome. And so I actually have a follow-up question for you, and you spoke a little bit about this. So since you've been in the government for a while, one of my questions is like, why government? Like, why does this all have to exist in government? And I think there's a lot of talk about like the private sector taking over things like space exploration or other sorts of endeavors, like really big, massive endeavors. Why as a public servant, do you see government having this role? Like, why do you think it's important? I know this wasn't on the questions, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It's a great question. I mean, I think that, let's see, I have a lot of thoughts about this. I mean, I think that government is the only organization that has to fulfill its mission. Like, we are here to protect people. We are here to help provide services that the market doesn't reach because it's not profitable for them, right? I mean, having worked in the private sector, having worked at a social enterprise startup, which has like 1 million different bottom lines they're trying to reach, social impact, but also for profit. Government is the one place where profit is not one of the primary motivating factors for what you do. You are there to catch the people that the market leaves behind. Like, the private sector primarily will always have to make a profit to sustain itself. It can do a lot of great other things, don't get me wrong. Like, the private sector generates a lot of positive social impact in a lot of ways, but if the business is going down, like, the primary thing they're going to have to take care of is keeping the lights on, and that means like bringing in additional revenue. The government doesn't have that as our primary KPI, right? There's a whole other subject about like what are KPIs for government and like how do we measure our own success, but we are here to serve those that like the other markets, the other industries don't. Does that mean we're the best at it? Not necessarily. Like, I think especially in the United States, there's a big social impact sector, a big nonprofit sector. How government works with these other players, be it philanthropy or nonprofits, is another big discussion point. But I think that our office specifically, and a role that we play within government, is we get to help define how to do this work in the most responsible way ever. Right? Like, we have to set the highest bar possible for how we do analytics work, for how we share data with the public. We're funded by taxpayer dollars. Like, we are responsible to them for every single thing that we do, every single thing that we say. And I think you only find that in government. Like, the incentives, the structure, like, only really exists in government for me. But
yeah, so add two thoughts here. I think, there are many communities, cities out there where folks say, like, if only government could be more like business, right? And to me, I'm like, that's not the model. That's not how we optimize, right? Because particularly in New York City and this administration in particular, thinking about what does fairness and equity mean for New Yorkers, that is the lens by which we are looking through how we better deliver services and engage with New Yorkers. And I think particularly, and we may get into this if we have time, I feel like we could also just sit here for the next 5 hours and have a good chat.
You guys want to stay for 5 hours,
yeah,
right?
if we want to stay for 5 hours, we'll probably get kicked out. But from my perspective, having the tours of duty in government, right? Like, the three of us up here, we have a mix of different experiences. So at least for Adrian and myself, and like philanthropy, working in nonprofits, working in the private sector, and then working at different levels of government, it does give you a much more rounded perspective of, hey, what are some practices that we should be adopting in our day-to-day work? But again, back to this question of this is government, and so therefore, I'm going to try to bring it full circle here. We also have to think constantly of who our stakeholders are and who we are accountable to. And again, in every single type of organization that I just named, slightly different who your shareholders or stakeholders are. And for us, because it is, at the end of the day, New Yorkers, for us, that's the answer, we have to be open in how we operate to the extent possible, to the nth degree, and figuring out how we are transparent all at the same time. And for those of you who heard me give remarks, it is balancing your day-to-day heads down focus on this is what my work is, and at the same time, I think a lot of what Adrian and the team has done is to bring that lens of, well, you also have to figure out how you explain that work, right? Explain the decision making, explain how we are making policies and coming to conclusions and recommendations. And that is, we'll get into a little bit, but that is certainly a part of the platform moving forward, is not just the open data, how do we unleash and unlock it, but how are we making decisions within government. And I think Molly and myself having that experience at the federal level, it's all conversations, and how do you unpack those conversations for a broader audience.
Yeah, and something that Kelly and I, our old boss, used to say a lot is that government is only as good as the people that are in it. And so when the people are good, government is good. And so I feel confident that we've got good people in the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics, and kind of threading the needle through that and what the heck you guys are actually doing every day in MODA, and trying to figure that out. So I'm going to take a second to tell a little story, and then I swear it will connect to a question. So these are two New York City public servants. There's another New York City-based public servant you guys probably have heard of, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She tweeted last night about fixing like this discrete problem with the post office wasn't delivering mail most of the 6 days a week that it was supposed to. It was like mail was only being delivered like 2 or 3 days in one area of the Bronx. And they got down to it, they figured out what was going on, and she tweeted about it and said like it was oddly thrilling or riveting, solving this like discrete problem. And those are like, as a public policy nerd, those are the things I'm like obsessed with. Like what was the problem, and then how did you solve it? Where was it going wrong and why? And how long was this happening and why was it happening so long? And then trying to make it better to better serve 8 million New Yorkers, or whoever your constituents are, whatever your government entity is. So all this is to say, I would love for you guys to give an example of your time in MODA where there was like this problem that you came into, and how did you solve it, and what did that mean for the lives of New Yorkers? Like, how would they see that in their everyday?
Yeah, so I'll also give 2 stories. One is New York focused more recently, and then one is pulling in a Boston story. So just a fully disclaimer, originally from Boston, Red Sox fan, although thankfully the mayor here is a Red Sox fan. But the first story is, speaking of Twitter, right? Like the fact, number one, I'm on Twitter, you can engage with me. And more recently, some of the incoming has been, this particular open data set has this particular column that either isn't updating or there's something wrong with it. And for me, it is, again, part of civic engagement is that we actually can hear what a lot of the concerns are and go ahead and just address that. So that has come up a few times just in the last week. The open data team, the New York City open data team, does that day to day, but I think actually having the ability to contact me and other leaders throughout the city, that's a huge part of the job. And then of course I am constantly in conversation with Noel online as well. So there was a question raised on why the city was not releasing data on bike counters, effectively, physical infrastructure that counts the number of bikes that pass through a particular location. And I got added onto that chain and checked with the team. And by the end of this year, this is something that the Department of Transportation had already committed to releasing by the end of the year. And so for me, there's another huge part here, which is we may issue reports and we may communicate out things, but if we're not finding the mediums and the channels that the broader community, let's say the bike community in this case, we still have to reach the folks and figure out what platforms we best do that in. The other story, which is my answer, my broad answer to a question that has not been teed up yet, and the question goes something like, what skills and experiences does it take to work in government, in local government, to be successful? And what skills does it take to be successful within a team like MODA? And the story from the city of Boston is that we had brought on a summer intern by the name of Lauren, and we had given her one assignment, and then something came up and she had to quickly go to the buildings department to go implement a new application, help with that training. And she got over there, and there was this table, and it kept, like, the keyboard had apparently, like, the keyboard stand had been falling down for months, and like she kept having to like move the keyboard table up, and folks were like, oh yeah, it's broken, like don't worry about it. And she said, I am going to just try to solve this problem. So it's the buildings department, there's plenty of people with screwdrivers around. So she went over and she asked, I think the second person had a screwdriver, and she fixed it. And I remember the story that got told was not how wonderful Lauren is, although she is very wonderful. The story that got told after she had gone there for the day and come back were other of my colleagues who said, Lauren found a screwdriver and she fixed the thing. And I think that that is something that to me is the spirit, or I hope to be the spirit of a lot of the folks that we work with, is that when you walk into a room, it's not just, is there a problem that only I am uniquely suited to solve for? It is there a problem and could I actually help at large? And that is the spirit that I know Molly, our experience during the Obama administration and the White House, that was certainly one, was not just, we're not just coming in and saying, what is a specific analytics question that is perfectly scoped that you have, but it is what are some of the challenges that keep you up at night at your agency? What are you really concerned and worried about? And again, you heard a lot of that from Manhattan Borough President Gale Brewer. She says these are the conversations that she is having, these are the agencies that she's communicating with, and these are some of their concerns. And obviously data has a lot to do with some of those concerns, but you have to bring it up a level. And I think that is, just in my more personal opinions here, but what it means to be a public servant. And certainly for me, part of the draw for coming back into local government was that direct tie to constituency groups, folks, residents here in the city can reach out to me directly, and that ability to help solve for problems is really important to me.
Yeah, and this actually brings me to my next question, which we'll answer, and then we'll open up for questions from the room, if there are any. And I'm curious about your personal past. So we kind of we went big, and then we went kind of small. We'll take a step back and figure out, how does one get to MODA? Like, and there is no one path, it sounds like, but if you want to tell us a little bit about your backgrounds, which and why you wanted to be there. And I know you kind of just commented on that a little bit, but your philosophy on public service, I'm really interested in.
Sure. So in terms of my path, I'm an industry hopper. So I studied public policy and economics, and my first job was in corporate retail as a business analyst. So I was doing reports of the top-selling toys at Sears and Kmart. That was my first job. And managing different vendor relationships, got transferred to the New York City office, doing business finance for the office here. And it was a great first job. I think that 15-year-old Adrian, like part of her might have died inside being like, oh my God, my first job is at Sears. But it was really the best first job I could have ever learned, or best first job I could have ever had, because I learned so much. My college education was fantastic, but it was very theoretical. I went to school where fun goes to die, and it's a very theoretical school, University of Chicago. Yeah. And so my first job was like use Excel, like figure out how to host a meeting, like figure out how to manage this vendor, like manage this project, all things I hadn't actually learned in school. So it was a really great boot camp in terms of how to actually get things done. And then in my spare time, I got really involved in New York in kind of the meetup scene around tech and startups. I went through a bit of a boot camp teaching you like how to start up your own company, had like a startup as a moonlighting thing for a few years, and then went to go work for a startup full-time, a social enterprise called Codified. I see someone in the room that I got to know while I was there. But Codified is an online marketplace for pro bono services. So nonprofits pay a small fee and they get access to pro bono professionals. While I was there, because it was a startup, I was the 11th hire. I was there for 3 years. Technically had 9 different jobs in that time, but startup life. But mostly spent my time bringing the company to new markets and then also building the enterprise business. And was just really fascinated to understand all of the challenges that like triple bottom line company has to face. It was a great experience, but I always knew I wanted to work in government. Having studied public policy, wanted to be able to really kind of get in the weeds. I also love big systems. I just find that to be really interesting.
She's working in the right spot.
Yeah. Kelly was teasing me the other day, saying like, maybe you'll do a PhD on like organizational theory, and I was like, that sounds amazing. And so working in big systems is something I really like, but on a more startup type level from the day-to-day basis. So I literally had a friend who said, the mayor just hired their first chief technology officer, they're building up a team, would you be interested? Threw my hat in the ring and started at what was then the mayor's office of tech and innovation. And just kind of found my niche as helping different city agencies engage the civic tech and startup sector through pro bono engagements. Since I'd come from this world of pro bono, like very tech adjacent, I figured out how to, I helped the administration for children's services do a foster care hackathon. We did a data jam around broadband. We did one for the Parks Department and a few others, and then got tapped on the shoulder by the then chief analytics officer to kind of help them with user engagement around open data. And I've been at MODA ever since for almost 2 years. And so that's my path. And I think that in terms of the why, I like having a bit of a thesis question for what I'm trying to accomplish in the job that I'm at in the moment. And I think that for me it was understanding government. I'm an experiential learner, and as much as I studied public policy in school, I learned so much more about how government actually works by being a butt in a seat. So I would say that I encourage everyone to do a public service tour as a part of your career. If you can swing it, if you're interested, it's the best way to actually become a very well-informed constituent to then understand how to engage in your government further. That being said, it shouldn't have to take that. My personal theory is that to be well versed in civics, you shouldn't have to work in government to understand how government works. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult for our democracy to function. So work in progress in terms of how to figure that piece out. But in the meantime, encourage everyone to work in government. It's never a dull moment. It is the most interesting job I have ever had. The span of the day is everything from someone calling you saying, is there a tool that exists that I can use and just plug an address into and figure out the community district? And I'm like, well, yes. And you should check out the Department of City Planning. They're amazing. And look at DCP Planning Labs. They have all sorts of amazing tools. Literally had this phone call earlier this week. And they're like, this is incredible. I didn't know this existed. To then having more strategic conversations with elected officials or deputy commissioners around this is what the open data law is, and here's how you need to participate in this program. So never a dull moment. If anything, work in government because it's really interesting.
So two things. One, I don't know if Kelly told you, but so we did a hackathon on foster care at the White House that I led, and then I believe the New York City one happened because it was born there. So
it's your fault.
This is my fault. I'm so sorry. If anyone wants to talk data and the child welfare system, please come see us after. I have so many thoughts. That could be a whole other panel. But really quickly, I'm just curious in the room before, and we'll have Kelly give her path, and then we'll turn over to questions. A show of hands of people who work in government in the room. Okay, so we got a few, and then maybe people who have worked in government at some point, so a few others. Okay, and then if you haven't, now we are deputizing you to go out and get a public service job following this panel. Yeah. And Kelly, do you want to tell us a little bit about your path?
Sure, but before I do, I'm plugging. We have 4 summer internships this summer. Please go online. I do not have the link, but we can. I will tweet that out after this session. I think applications are due March 17th, and then we also just opened up a policy analyst position as well. I will also tweet out more information about that, or you can scroll through my historical tweets.
I saw that job posting on your Twitter.
Yeah, you retweet it, thank you.
It's the top there when you put in MODA NYC, so it's easy to find.
So I am, just for the interest of time, going to give the highlights of the things that I've done, because y'all don't have that much time, and I do want to get to audience questions. From my perspective, I think one theme or arc is that when you get the call, you take the call. And what I mean by that is this particular position here to serve the city and this administration was a call that I had gotten. My return to serve at the White House at the very end of the Obama administration was a call that I gotten when I was in Boston at the City Hall there, and it kind of goes back a little bit. Some of you in the room are probably looking at me being like, what does that mean? Like, yeah, of course I'll take the call, but who's calling? And what I mean to say is that if you think about what your work is and what you yourself uniquely are an expert in, or at least in the top 5% of industry in, and I will push you, if you haven't thought about that, to think about that. That when you are building your work and your brand and everything that you're doing, there's a certain also element of the work to make sure that you're telling other folks what you're doing, right? I think that is something that oftentimes we get solely focused on our work, but to be able to tell the broader story, to be able to tell that in a compelling way, just to pick on Chris Wong there from Planning Labs, tell that in a compelling way so that other folks know what you are working on, because the call that you get is never from the person that you've worked with, it is from the person that you've worked with sitting down and having dinner with somebody else, and that somebody else saying, you know, I'm trying to find somebody who's working, who understands local government, who understands the White House, and who understands data and analytics and how to move it forward. And so that was partly actually the story of how I had gotten the call in from the White House to go back to DC. And I also say the other point I want to make around the call is that I think particularly around my career, particularly around these different organizations that I've gone to, oftentimes it's only in hindsight that you see the connection points. That is only in hindsight that I can say that actually my time in Boston, that made sense because I was able to take it up a level. How do we take these local practices, local government practices, and bring that back to the national level? Because at the national level, the best work done at the federal level when we were there was to lift the work of communities, right? Let's not start from scratch. Let's go find what the best practices are that are out there. And then from the White House, taking a detour into philanthropy to figure out what are the different incentive pressure points outside of government. How does academia, how do we fund academia to work with governments? And then full circle back into New York City. All of that for me, again, in hindsight, makes much more sense. When you're thinking about it in the moment, it does sometimes feel like I'm taking a bit of a leap of faith that this particular experience, that this next thing, I'm going to learn a lot. I may not know every single thing about what I'm stepping into, but certainly the first time that I had served at the White House in the Domestic Policy Council I was at a federal agency and gotten a call saying, would you be willing to work in the West Wing? And I said, I'd be willing to mop the floors in the West Wing. I'll do whatever it takes. And certainly when I was there during that time, I did not have a public policy degree, but it was an entire year plus of basically getting what felt like a public policy degree because I actually saw it in action. And I'll kind of close this out again. I could keep going about other stories from my career, but I'll close out by saying I think that is part of the story of MODA and the future of what we're trying to work on is knowing that we haven't figured it out, and we're trying to be as participatory as we can about establishing what that future vision is. When I came in middle of October, again, I think we've embarrassed Adrian enough today, I think. But I think from my perspective, coming in and saying to Adrian, like she also took a leap of faith that I was a new CAO coming in and saying, this is the broad constellation of things that we could work on in the future. I'm asking you to take a leap of faith that we're going to figure out this vision moving forward. And I think as you all continue on in your careers, as you look at different jobs, to think about the organizations and the individuals who can help push that forward. Those are the top line points that I would have. And I think for me, public service and being a public servant it's kind of like the best job in the world. And that it is a part of my job to help solve other people's problems. And it's not something that I do like on the side. It's not something that I do in my free time, but that like every single moment of my working day, like that's my job and that's my responsibility. And like I have to take it seriously and get to build and lead a team that does that is pretty awesome day to day. Yeah. I could keep.
Yeah. I just have to say that this is not just town hall panel Kelly talking about public service. This is like everyday Kelly. This is how she always talks about public
Fortunately
service.
or unfortunately for everyone around me. Yeah.
Cool. All right, so we'll take our last 20 or so minutes to open it up to questions from the room. Yeah, in the back.
Yeah, thanks so much for everything you're doing. I have a question about compliance. So New York City has some of the best open data laws probably in the country. I understand data is just a means to an end and a precondition for a lot of other stuff, but do you have thoughts? I mean, I work at a nonprofit that will remain nameless, but there's a lot of data there that, as I read all the laws, like really ought to be open. Have you thought about like different strategies for making sure it happens? Maybe secure drop style, tip line, or ways that I could get someone from the outside to ask for it. Like the speed bumps often seem emergent, and it's unclear how to make that happen, but someone has to ask for it for us to actually be motivated to provide it.
I'm happy to take that. So I love that you have those ideas, and I've talked to Kelly a few times about wanting to have an anonymous hotline for people to say, I found some data that should be on open data. The closest thing we have right now is that we have a service that is actually mandated by law, which is your ability to request a data set, which then triggers an audit by a city agency. So if you go to the Contact Us page on the Open Data website, there's also, you can submit a general inquiry, an idea for a partnership, and one of those drop-down options is request a data set. And that is the only option that requires the agency to then go, figure out if the data exists. If the data, not all data exists, I'll just put that out there, but if the data exists, can it be made public? If it can be made public, when will it be made public? And to get back to you within 2 months. 2 months sounds like a long time, but for some of these city agencies that have thousands of people in them, our one open data coordinator for the entire agency sometimes has to like track down across multiple divisions. So where might this data live? Who is the person who might be collecting this data? Who might be that data owner? Like, I assure you that it takes time. And yeah, so that's a process you should be aware of. And then otherwise, from a compliance perspective, we are very fortunate to have a series of laws, amendments that support the open data program here in New York. But one thing that when I started working on open data became a priority for me was how do we think about the balance of carrots and sticks, right? Because I think for a lot of city agencies, we don't want them to think about open data as this thing they have to do because there's a law. We want them to understand that this is the new way of working. Like, this is just normal for government in terms of how you operate as you start to collect more data. Think about what parts of that data can be made public and why, and engage your constituents around that data. So we've been doing a lot of work to build up our community of open data coordinators. We presented them with awards this fall for the first time. There's a lot of them here today for the first time ever participating in School of Data or even Open Data Week. I think last year we had maybe a handful of agencies participate in Open Data Week, and as Kelly mentioned in her opening remarks, now we have more than 20. So a lot of it, there's the compliance component, but there's the culture change component, right? Like, how do we get agencies to move towards embracing the idea of having dialogue with their constituents using the same starting point of information, which can be that open data. So, sure.
We'll go to this side of the room and then we'll bounce back. Yeah.
Hi, I work with one of the city agencies, and I think particularly within government, the access to large amounts of information and ability, large amounts of data and ability to make that into information, it has been emerging, and leadership developed their decision-making processes before that was so available. And so when that comes in, oftentimes the data can point in a different direction than their developed systems come in. So what are your strategies to help to move it in the direction of the new opportunities?
Yeah, I can take a start. So from my perspective, I think you hit on, we talked a little bit about lifting the floor. So this concept of lifting the floor, we focused more or less on analysts, directors, managers, et cetera, throughout the city. I think what you are hitting on, or what at least I'm translating into, is how are we upping the executive level decision-making game, if you will. And I think from my perspective, a lot of that has to do with how are we equipping executives, commissioners as an example, to ask those types of questions, right? Of what data are you consulting? What are the assumptions that you are making? Here are some other considerations that I have as well. I think that just ties back to what I had said a little bit earlier, which is if you are just looking at the data without an understanding of the business and the operations and the processes day to day, those insights may not actually match to what the questions are. And I've certainly seen, I think throughout a lot of our city agencies, some of the strongest teams are the ones where the heads of their analytics offices or departments come straight from business line folks who understand how things work. Because I think you're absolutely right. There's a lot of recommendations, policy insights, et cetera, that are being built out around an understanding of the data. And I think particularly for those of you in the room who are interested in working in local government, and this is something we've talked about internally within MODA, the very first step is like an understanding of how the processes work. And an understanding of how government and specific government agencies work as well. But I think for me, yeah, I think also a part of that lifting the floor is how are we going out and really getting executives engaged, because I do think that a bit more of the translation between executives and maybe a data scientist or data analyst is really, really important, so that people don't feel like their ship's passing in the night, if you will. But good question. Cool.
My question's about data quality. So thinking back to the example that you just raised about bicycle traffic monitoring, this is something that comes to mind because I used to work in bicycle traffic monitoring. But also comes to mind thinking about my daughter's school. I'm sure many people are familiar with the site InsideSchools.org. So this is a nonprofit that the Department of Education shares data with annually and puts out, it's all kinds of data about schools, like a map of the zone, a survey of the teachers. It's really interesting, all the different stuff that's on there. But for example, for my daughter's school, all the data is wrong. And in my experience in bicycle traffic monitoring, depending on the type of device and the way that it's installed, you can get a huge range of error. And even using the same device from the same manufacturer installed by the same team at two different locations, you can get two totally different confidence intervals in terms of how, it could be off by 30%. It could be off by 5%. And that's helpful to know from an open data perspective in terms of using the data. But when people go to use this data, they're like, well, it's on Inside Schools, so that's what it is. Or like, well, the city released this data, so now it's official. It's official, this is how many cyclists are using this corridor. So, there's this danger of like rushing to transparency before understanding that actually we might be transparently telling a lie about what's actually happening without malicious intent or meaning to lie. So my question is, have you guys thought strategically from the level that you're at about how to communicate quality at the same time as communicating the raw data? And have you thought about how to engage the community of people who are interested in open data, but really the community writ extremely large, Inside Schools being actually a great example of this. And I don't mean this critically, because I have to say actually like New York does a better job of all of this stuff than like anywhere I've ever seen. So I'm setting like a super high bar here, but I'm just interested in what the conversations are in your office regarding quality and kind of systematically across all these different use cases, how to communicate quality, how to audit quality, and how to engage the community around quality and raise general understanding of this issue.
Yeah, so I can give, I'll give some internal insights, because so this data quality question is not just around open data, right? Like I think tie-ins here of when we're looking at the actual data set, we're looking at the numbers and the actual rows, there are these similar type questions internally of, is this the truth? Is this the absolute truth? And I think the one very short story I'll tell, some of you here may have heard if you've come to another session, is that when I was in Boston, we had presented to the Commissioner Evans there at the time, a few years ago when he was the head of the police department there, and just presenting like a very straightforward dashboard of some of the basic crime stats across the city. And we had gotten there like 30 minutes late because traffic is terrible everywhere, including in Boston. And so we rushed in and we pulled up the dashboard, and you have a room full of leadership, police department leadership. And they all looked up and they all said, that's the wrong number. And very, very graciously, the police commissioner said, that's okay, like let's walk through everything else, because it was a mock-up, but we did have up-to-date information. And I was very thrown off, because I said, well, we like triple-checked these numbers and we triple-checked the data sets. And the actual number in question was the number of homicides year to date, which is a major measure and a major metric. A lot of you are nodding your heads at me, for every big city. And I said, how could we possibly be off by this number? And we huddled immediately after the meeting, and it was, when we looked at the data, that the reports, as you all know, around homicides, it is someone keeping track. The actual data doesn't, there's a medical examiner determination that must be made that it is a homicide, and so therefore our number was lower than the real number. But I think to this question of data quality, I tell that story because I do think that there's all of these contextual pieces around the work about how a city operates. The fact that like this story that I just told you is something that you all would hopefully say, oh, that makes a lot of sense, that there's a process by which a specific field changes. But that without understanding that context and folks just looking at numbers, absolutely. Those numbers may look different, but that is something that we can explain for, actually. And so I think as something that, again, Adrian and I have talked about moving forward, the actual quality of whether it is open data on the open data portal or internal systems and data as well. Think about the number of times, there's a lot of city agencies here in the room, the number of times one city agency hands their data to another city agency, the other city agency picks it up and says, well, like the quality of this data is not, like we can't do much with this information, and it's also really, really hard to integrate our different data sets because we call something just a wee bit different from the other agency. And so absolutely top of mind, I think, again, thinking of MODA and the office as being one where we are trying to like move a bunch of different bowling balls all at the same time, because we do need to bring city agencies to the table to have that conversation. But there is no shortage of interest in upping our data quality game inside of the city. Do you want to talk about like metadata?
Yeah, so I'll just add a little bit to that. I mean, I think you bring up a really great question, and there are so many components related to that. I think that from a cultural perspective, quantitative information tends to be trusted more than qualitative information. We see a stat, we think it's the truth. So I think that to that, like I think that having additional context makes everything so much more important. And something that there's actually a session here at School of Data this afternoon called Metadata for All, which is, okay, awesome, which is going to be led by an amazing rockstar team of data librarians who were leading a pilot initiative for us this summer in order to help us figure out, well, how do we help improve the quality of the metadata on the open data platform? because there can be this instinct that when you do an analysis, you see these outliers, like what is this? I can't trust this data. But who knows, like maybe there's some additional context and it just wasn't captured in the data dictionary accurately, or there isn't a full understanding of what that agency is. And the data might not look perfect, but you can then understand more about it, right? So I think a big part of our solution is that additional context, and I encourage you to learn more by going to the session this afternoon. And then the other piece is, I'll completely admit that there's a need for us to think more about like QA, about working with our agencies. Like we have 2,300 data sets and work with more than 100 open data coordinators across the city. We have 3 folks over at the IT agency who act like account managers for all of those open data coordinators. And then, percentages of time of people over at the Mayor's Office of Data Analytics who work on open data full time. So it's a pretty big operation. We get 30,000 visits to the site on average per week. Sometimes the best way for us to know that something isn't working is because somebody emailed us and let us know. And that's not ideal from an operational perspective. So it's a known area that needs like more support and attention for the program.
And we've got about 5 minutes, so we have time for like one question. And I'll maybe go somewhere in the back, and no pressure, it's the last question, so just it better be amazing. But maybe all the way in the back there, yeah.
So you mentioned you have 100 data coordinators and people trust the data. Have you given thought about training the public relations officers to use the data when they release a press release, instead of having a press release with just some claims, maybe linked to the data set? And if they make a claim after we make that open data as well, and give context to the data?
Could we get that in writing so we can?
It was recorded.
Yeah, get it to our press office. I can't make any commitments right now. I think absolutely this question of how do we get to a specific measure ties back to this earlier question. I think it's really important that we provide folks a better context. Because I do think that actually showing folks not only where the information is coming from, but what is the formula by which you are getting to a particular measure. For those of you who are really, really wonky, there's something called the Mayor's Management Report that comes out every single year. There's also a preliminary one, the MMR and the PMMR. If you work in New York City government, there'll be terms you're familiar with. But that's another good example of we are coming to these measures, we are counting, and we are publicly reporting. And different agencies and specific individuals are responsible for aggregating all that information and then reporting on it. But I would love to see a near-term state where we get better about saying, like, this is the number that we have gotten to, this is the information, you run the analysis, and you'll get exactly to the same spot. A little bit of this, like, show your homework, if you will, is really important to me, and I think more broadly across the team, one thing that we've talked about, at least internally within the analytics exchange, is just the concept of open analytics. Like, what does that look like? We've started with open data. That's been the last seven plus years here in the city. What is really the next phase of that? And I will, I think, try to plug. We also, it's Saturday, so yesterday, 2 days ago, on Thursday, we announced the first ever Open Data Advisory Council for the city. So there's 23 members from across the entire city who are going to help us really run an inclusive process about defining what the future vision of the open data program and portal will look like. And as you all are starting to hear here, it's not just about open data, but we're talking about data and analytics at large.
How do we get on that council?
Okay, so the Open Data Advisory Council, we had an open call for applications last fall, and it was awesome. We had more than 45 people apply, which was incredible. Some of like 20 originally, but then we arced it a little bit bigger to like 23. I think some of the hardest decisions we've ever had to make was just like, oh my gosh, we would love for this to be 100 people, but that's going to be a lot. And I think part of the goal is to open up channels for feedback and for governance support in the program itself. But yeah, we just announced it earlier this week. I'm really excited for all those folks. It's a 2-year appointment. They'll be meeting twice annually, but there'll also be kind of email updates. It doesn't mean that we're going to be working with this group exclusively. Like, we're not going to be disappearing, only talking to this group of people. The goal is more, right? So yeah, stay tuned for more from them. And then just to add a little bit more in response to your question, given our open data coordinators, I mentioned that it's been a priority to build that up as a community internally. One of the next goals is to grow their friend group within the agency. So you can imagine that for an open data coordinator to be successful, they have to know their CIO really well. They need to know the head of external affairs really well. It would be helpful if they knew the chief of staff so that they know all of the different divisions and all of the potential different data owners and priorities within the agency. They have to be best buddies with their FOIL officer, their general counsel. So there's an ecosystem of people within the agency that make open data a reality. And so how can we bring more people into the fold? Because open data has to be ideally an agency-wide mandate, and that's something that is just one person's responsibility.
And we have -3 minutes, but in true town hall style, maybe we'll just have some closing statements, 30 seconds, what you want to leave the group with. Kelly, you want to start?
Find your tribe.
You have a few more seconds.
Okay, fine. All right. What I mean by that is that none of the work that we do, you can do alone. Right. So I think what you all have seen today is the power of community, and I think inside of New York City government, it is day to day me bothering Adrian with all of my ideas and thoughts, and receiving that in turn. The broader MODA team. Working in partnership across all of the different agencies, open data coordinators, et cetera, and then working in partnership with all of you. But again, this is a broader community effort. This is work that is hard. Like Adrian said, we are interested in really changing and moving and pushing systems, and that doesn't happen overnight. And so when I say find your tribe, part of your tribe is definitely here today. Figure out other folks you can lean on. And I definitely went over 30 seconds just then, but yeah, those are my closing.
Adrian?
I would add, we're just giving you a bunch of action items, but find your issue. So figure out the thing that you care about and that you would like to see change. Don't necessarily start your own nonprofit to solve that problem. Understand the ecosystem of things that already exists. Do your best to learn how your local government, state government, federal government works. Understand other initiatives that are happening around the world that maybe could be replicated here, and take action. We need more people who are asking questions. You have 300,000 people in the city of New York who are being paid by you and who work for you. You have a responsibility to help hire those elected officials by going to vote and by asking questions about how your money is being used to make the city a better place. So get involved. Figure out the thing that keeps you up at night. Come up with a thing that keeps you up at night if you don't have something like that.
We have a few.
But
Yeah.
But just start, when you leave School of Data today and you're on your way home, give yourself the challenge of trying to identify all of the different government touch points between Galvanize and where you live. You're on the subway, you're taking the sidewalk, you see a street tree, you threw something away in a trash can. Then ask yourself, what might that look like as a data point? Go on nyc.gov, learn more about that data set, learn more about how your city works, and get involved.
Yeah. Wait, you also are going to give your parting. You have to.
I think it's get involved in government in any way that you can, and whether that means working in government, doing a tour of duty in public service, registering to vote. I hope everyone in the room is already registered to vote if you're able to. And yeah, I think being an active participant in civic life is important, and there's a bare minimum that we can all do, and we should all be striving to reach that bare minimum. And the only way that things get better is if we do it. We used to say in the White House also, we are the ones that we're waiting for. No one is coming to save us. It's us. So we'll leave you with that, and it's probably lunchtime, I guess. So I'm sure we are standing between you and a sandwich, so we will let you go. Thank you, guys.